Okay, everybody. I spoke to Michael Caputo on Thursday, May 23rd. Caputo was a campaign advisor to Trump in 2016. He also has a longer political history with Trump in New York, which we get into. But in his capacity on the Trump campaign in 2016, he ended up getting embroiled in Robert Mueller's Special Counsel investigation. And Caputo has a lot of interesting details on that, as well as broader reflections on what the Russia investigation signifies on a deeper fundamental level, which was interesting to delve into. Anyway, it's a long discussion, and here we go. Okay, Michael Caputo, thank you for doing this.
Of course. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so we want to get into a little, we want to get into detail about your dealings with the Mueller investigation and where things stand now, but something caught my attention this past week, which was Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, who I'm sure you know well, did a thread on Twitter where she basically theorized that Donald Trump's ascendance can be traced in some way to the New York State gubernatorial primary in 2010.
In a lot of ways it can. You know, I first met the president in 1988 at the Republican convention where he and Roger Stone actually talked about him running for president. It seemed to me like that was the first time that the president may have ever spoken about it. So if you want to trace the thread, that goes all the way back to New Orleans in 1988. But and also he tried to test the waters in 2000. He played with the idea at other times as well. He also, actually went on the road in 2000 and had some events. None of them turned out to be these massive rallies that he's become familiar with now. But actually in 2013, some leaders of the New York State Republican Party who had grown frustrated with too many losing gubernatorial campaigns running against Andrew Cuomo, they were looking around for a candidate. Their model that they thought that could win was a self-funder who had high name ID. Necessarily, that meant someone who had plenty of money laying around and may have been a TV series. And in New York, there was really only one of those people. That was Donald Trump. And because they knew that I knew him and that I had, been intersecting with him nigh on, 20 plus years, they asked me to introduce them to him. And I called, got an appointment. We went in there. I expected to sit for 5 minutes while he told them he wasn't interested. But that meeting turned into a 4 to 6 month flirtation with running for governor against Andrew Cuomo, and two different rallies that probably were the biggest speeches, political speeches when it comes to attendance that he had so far. So I think he got his first taste for running for public office in a competitive environment where we were actually trying to line up the county chairs of New York State to back him and basically thwart an existing run by a county executive from the Hudson Valley area. And it was like counting heads, inviting county chairs into Trump Tower. At one point in time, we had 80+% of the weighted vote of the 63 county chairs, and he had met with or talked to 55 of them. So he got a real taste for it. He eventually, all that time, he was telling me, Michael, I really want to go for the big thing. He called it the big thing. And he would ask me questions like, well, how would running for governor help me in my idea that I want to run for the presidency? So, he was always looking at the gubernatorial race through the lens of eventually running for president. But he got his first taste of an actual primary-oriented campaign running against a juggernaut Democrat in Cuomo, which I would compare to Hillary Clinton favorably, actually. And I think he liked it.
Well, in a way, his exploration of the gubernatorial run in 2013 was apt preparation for a future presidential run, because if you're dealing with these local officials on the county level, these party figures, I mean, those are people who you have to court eventually in a nationwide sense to secure the nomination of the party. So it actually makes sense in that way for him to have viewed it through the prism of potentially leveraging those connections later on in a presidential run.
Yeah, and a whole different cast of characters. So, I mean, of course, Michael Cohen was there, Roger Stone was there, Sammy Nunberg was there, Kellyanne was there too. But I think Roger was trying to thwart the gubernatorial race the entire time. He spent, slashing my tires because he thought it was a bad idea. And in fact, it wasn't a great idea because he saw it as interfering necessarily in the presidential run. Because imagine if he had won the governorship in 2014 in New York State and then announced a year later a run for the presidency, that would have had a really bad look, right? And of course, what was really interesting as well, if you get into the details of electoral politics and campaigning and primaries and, what you got to do in order to win the Republican primary and in fact, any presidential primary, we initially we were trying to get him to visit with chairs and actually go see chairs in their home counties, which, New York is a pretty far-flung place. And he resisted that. And he said, listen, maybe I'll do that once this thing gets rolling. But I really would rather just talk to them on the phone and see if we can transport them to Trump Tower. And it worked. He had such a big name identification and such a reputation as a businessman and a public figure that people would come to him. And so when he pulled the trigger on the presidential primary, he was already in the mindset that I don't have to go to all the Republican Party Lincoln Day dinners that the rest of the candidates do. If you look at his record during the primary, he only went to a handful of existing Republican events. He held his own because when he was thinking about running for governor in New York State, he found out that if he builds it, they will come.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason why Maggie Haberman brought up that history is because she was suggesting that Carl Paladino was in some sense a precursor to Trump in terms of the political style, in terms of the issue emphases. And you worked for Paladino when he successfully defeated who had been the favorite in the gubernatorial primary, Rick Lazio. Do you see that as an apt comparison on Haberman's part?
I do, actually. And I'll tell you why. When I was living in Miami Beach and kind of having a great life. I was actually living on a tugboat with a parrot and had my hair grown long and didn't ever wear any shoes. And I got talked into coming home to Buffalo, where I was originally from, to run Carl Paladino's gubernatorial effort. And when I was looking at the poll numbers, I hadn't been in New York for quite some time. Living on a tugboat, off the coast of Miami Beach, you tend to be a little bit isolated. The only person I was talking to was my parrot, and she only had 500 words. So, I came back and I saw a really stark contrast in the New York that I had left in, let's say, 1986. And to me, it was a desolate view. It was as if a bomb had gone off. I mean, our economy had already been decimated by the departure of the steel factories, the steel mills in Buffalo. We lost tens of thousands of jobs when all of those jobs went overseas. And, so I had this contrast after being gone for like 25, 30 years. And I came back and I realized when I was doing polling analysis and message analysis and things of that sort, that the New York had really hit the skids and that people were really angry about it. And my goal for Carl was to try to figure out how to harness that anger. And we did. I mean, if you remember back in 2010, that was the nadir of the Tea Party. And we had 107 Tea Parties in New York State and 63 county committees. The county committees, the Republican committees, would not invite Carl to their confabs because, the state chairman had decided that he wasn't fit to run. So we went only to Tea Party events. There were many more of them. And that grew into a statewide campaign built on frustration. In fact, Carl's stump speech was very much similar to Donald Trump's stump speech. And our theme was negative. Our theme was, I'm mad as hell too, Carl. And our campaign video when he announced was that scene from Network when the anchor was having a meltdown on television and people were throwing up their windows and leaning out their sashes and saying, I'm mad as hell too, if you remember that wonderful movie. And we played that at the announcement. And that was the theme. And we ended up upsetting the entire primary field because we were able to actually understand the anger, harness that anger, and turn it into a movement. And that, to go full circle, in 2014, I could tell that the president was losing interest in the gubernatorial effort. We were talking on a regular basis, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. And I was putting him in touch with county chairmen, on conference calls and such. So he and I were interacting on the regular, right? And those things kind of, went from 4 or 5 times a day to once a day to once every other day. And I could tell he was losing interest. So I invited Carl Paladino to have dinner with him. The president was interested. Why wouldn't he want to talk to the last Republican nominee, right, for governor before he made his decision? So I flew with Carl into New York and sat at a dinner in the first floor of the Trump International building right there on the Park in New York City. I think it's called Jean Pierre's or something like that. It's a restaurant in the first floor of his building. And I remember sitting the two of them down, and I'll tell you, that was one of the most incredible experiences I've had in politics, to watch these two men meet, bond, and then depart as friends. Today, they're very good friends, but Carl spent his time telling the president what it was like to run on, to surf on a wave of anger and frustration. And a great example of this long kind of meandering conversation was Carl told the president, we use the theme, I'm mad as hell too, Carl. And it caught on across the state. We would drive down the road and people would scream out their cars, I'm mad as hell too, Carl, thumbs up, And the president, in reply to Carl, said, I love that, Carl, but it's too negative. What's on the other side of that coin? And the president, waited for the answer, and Carl kind of looked at him quizzically, and Carl said, I guess something hopeful about fixing it. And the president said, what about make America great again? That was 2014.
So I think Haberman's implication in that Twitter thread was that Trump not only took some lessons from Carl Paladino's run in 2010 in terms of harnessing the anger of the electorate that had been untapped, he also emulated some of what Haberman would probably characterize as Paladino's less savory qualities. So drawing on stereotypes of Muslims and immigrants and that kind of thing. That was the insinuation in the thread. And it's true that around that time, Trump had been on his mini crusade about Obama's birth certificate.
Right.
And Trump later on in the 2016 general election campaign admitted that whole thing was nonsense, essentially. So is there a connection to be drawn in that specific regard?
I think so. I'll be honest with you. All the years I've known the president, I've never discussed the President Obama's birth certificate with him. I don't think it was something that dominated his frontal lobe. But it might have been a strategy or a tactic of some sort. And he may have truly believed it. A lot of people did. But having said that, I put something like 35 or 40,000 miles on a vehicle with Carl and never left the state of New York. A lot of my job was to try to insert a filter. One of the reasons why Carl is so beloved in Western New York is that he absolutely says what's on his mind. The reason why Carl Paladino has real enemies and hate around him in Western New York is because he says exactly what's on his mind. And I spent a lot of my time, trying to dig out from problems that were created by an unfiltered candidate. Now, I'm not saying Carl was wrong, but as a candidate, I think Carl's race was maybe my 73rd that I had done in my life, 74th. And, Carl was not a traditional candidate. I mean, I would say, why the heck did you say that? And he said, because that's the truth. And I would say, yes, Carl, that's the truth, but nobody wants to hear it. And he would say back, well, perhaps it's time for people to hear that. Now, for example, a great example, I'm riding in the car with Carl, and he's on the phone with the Associated Press reporter, and he had this idea that he would repurpose some of the prisons in New York, and because our prison population is steadily declining, and refurbish them as maybe sanatoriums, resorts, places where people can go and instead of cells, apartments. He's a developer. He thinks of things the way that Donald Trump does. A building with bars can become a bar. So he had this idea. We never really fully developed it. I kind of shrugged when he said it, but his idea was, some of the folks who were on public assistance, might benefit from workforce training and things of that sort, and we could put them into an environment, where an educational institution of some sort, where they could learn basic skills. Now, I always thought that was, kind of out there, but maybe we'd talk it over. And then he just said it to the Associated Press reporter, who then wrote up that Carl Paladino wanted to put minority young men into prisons in along the Hudson in order to teach them how to shave. The fact of the matter is, Carl's idea hadn't been fully fleshed out as a campaign leader, as the manager of the campaign. It's not something that it was baked or even ready for prime time or perhaps even appropriate. But it didn't matter because he didn't have a filter and he wanted to share ideas. So in the end, I think that the president looked closely at the Paladino effort. He realized that campaigning without a filter in a deep blue state like New York could have its downsides, but it also had its upsides, because Carl Paladino differentiated himself from the Democrat who was trying to get into the Republican primary, Steve Levy, and Rick Lazio, because he just captured the anger by speaking his mind. And I think that the president learned both the upside of that and the downside.
And part of the reason why I brought this up as a precursor to our discussion about the Russian investigation is because, having studied almost every aspect of this investigation, I'm of the mind that it was motivated, at least in part, to impede or delegitimize Trump while he was a candidate, and then even later when he was president. And I wonder if you would acknowledge any irony in that, given Trump's intention, it would seem, during that phase when he was exploring Iran in 2012 or 2016, the reason why he brought up the birth certificate when he did was because it, in some sense, served to delegitimize Obama, because Obama would not have been constitutionally eligible if what Trump was speculating was true. Now, of course, the Russian investigation is on a whole different level, and it's with the backing of the state, the FBI, the CIA, all that. So I'm not comparing the scope of the two things. Just saying, on principle, it seems that what Trump was attempting to do with Obama took, in some sense, the form of the effort to delegitimize him later on.
I think that you're on to something here. But I can tell you that a couple of things come to mind. First of all, I can remember a couple of times where Carl Paladino came out with things off the top of his head that were unproven and ended up tripping us up. One of them, for example, was with Maggie Haberman at a hotel cafe in Manhattan, where he just brought up the idea that Andrew Cuomo had a girlfriend, and Haberman, who at the time I think at the time was working at the New York Post, and she, her head snapped, and she looked at Carl and she said, "Do you want to repeat that?" And I'm trying to kick Carl under the table, and he said, "Yeah, he's got a girlfriend." Now, all of us had heard that he had extramarital affairs. None of it was anything anyone could prove. They were just salacious rumors, but Carl went ahead and laid it out there. And that commentary ended up being a real sideline, a real sidetrack for our campaign for 10 days. A lot of what Carl would talk about was unproven stuff that no other candidate would ever speak of. Trying to make a point about something that was ended up being false, or using facts and figures that were a departure from the truth. And I think that perhaps he did that in order to drop small bombs. I mean, I got in trouble with Carl because after the campaign, I went to a forum at the New School, in November of 2010, and they said, well, why did Carl do these things? And I said, Carl, in some ways, enjoys dropping a turd into the punch bowl. Well, everybody laughed, and, the imagery was obviously inappropriate. But Carl ended up getting mad because he thought I was making fun of him. But that's not what I meant by that comment. I thought that Carl loved to speak truth to power, even if it wasn't quite proven to be true. And in the end, that was just like Donald Trump. And also the reaction to that by the Republican establishment in New York was many of the, kind of, if you wanted to say, deep state Republican establishment types went all in for Cuomo. They started donating to him. They started organizing groups to campaign against Paladino. I mean, these were Republicans who had been the most important people in the state of New York, who were basically, cut out of the Republican nominee fighting Andrew Cuomo.
And just to interject really briefly, I mean, Cuomo was infamous, at least among his left-wing critics in New York, for either tacitly or even at times seemingly overtly enabling Republicans to keep control of the state Senate, which lasted until just this past cycle in 2018.
He didn't just enable it. He did make it possible. If he wasn't willing to work with a coalition of Republicans and errant Democrats who barely hold on by the fingernails, the control of the New York State Senate, if he wasn't willing to work with them, they wouldn't have existed. So he was the reason for it. The Independent Democratic Caucus that made a Republican majority possible was a concoction of the Democrat, probably cooked up behind closed doors, as everything is in Albany. So you're right. And I think the Republicans who backed Cuomo then, again, backed him in 2014 and backed him again in 2018. And that put Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo in a position here in New York to say to Republican donors, if I see your name on any Republican gubernatorial opponent's finance records, campaign finance records, you're out. So now in New York, we are completely and absolutely run by the deep state, if you want to call it that. And I used to laugh at that phrase, deep state. Roger Stone, I was Roger Stone's driver in my 20s. He used to talk about the deep state in 1985 or in 1989, right? I never became comfortable with that term until I watched Andrew Cuomo assemble that, and then watched President Trump fight that. And a lot of the reason why the Republican establishment types who, made up the masthead of Weekly Standard or whatever, they were excluded from Republican leadership for the first time in their lives. And it was mostly because President Donald Trump was acting a bit like Carl Paladino. He said some things that they were uncomfortable with, and he didn't care what they thought.
And then just close the circle there in terms of the delegitimization parallel between Trump and the birth certificate, and then later on Trump being delegitimized by the FBI, CIA. I mean, to what extent is it fair to cite that as kind of like history echoing itself or something? Again, as I acknowledge, it's nowhere near on the same scale, but there is something there.
That's an interesting thought. I'd not thought of that. I can tell you that, I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns in the United States and more outside, and countless congressional, Senate, and statewide races. And I can tell you that I never saw a candidate defy gravity like Donald Trump does. People, they fact check him and call him a liar thousands of times in the last 2 years. There's no question that the president enjoys his own form of exaggeration, and he always has, especially from the podium in a rally. But that same tendency was not intolerable in any other presidential candidate or any other president, any other Senate, House, gubernatorial candidate. You could not be someone who played loosely with the truth in your own special way It was just unacceptable. Gravity brought you down. The gravity would pull you down with every exaggeration or lie. And President Trump, people, because of the size of his personality, because of the immense nature of his name identification, I've never worked with a presidential candidate anywhere in the world who had 100% name identification. There were elements of this candidate model that defied any categorization. We'd never seen it before. Not to mention the fact that the man was a billionaire, right? So many things go into his ability to defy gravity that when the deep state came after him, if you're comfortable with that word, or the national security operations under President Obama, they were in for something that they weren't ready for. They thought that they could just cut the Achilles tendon here and there, and that the candidate would go down like they'd done it before. But try as they might, they have not been able to bring him down. And I think that's his ability to defy gravity.
As to the term deep state, I mean, when that term first started entering popular circulation, what you'd often hear is critics dismissing it as paranoid or conspiratorial. But there's actually been a robust literature, largely but not exclusively on the left, actually, prior to Trump, talking about the deep state, just in the sense that the national security apparatus in the federal government is so expansive that it has some autonomy. It has certain autonomous characteristics that aren't necessarily dependent on whoever is in power at the top. Is that close to how you would characterize what the deep state actually is, or is there a better term to use in relation to the Russia investigation?
It's interesting. You're actually hitting on a key theme in the book that I'm writing right now, and it's interesting that for years I was absolutely uncomfortable with the term deep state. I would sit in the driver's seat of Roger Stone's antique Jaguar, driving him around Washington in '89 or '88, I guess it was '86. And hear him talking about the deep state and lecturing me. Caputo, JFK was killed by LBJ. And I just would roll my eyes into the rearview mirror. And he would, I rejected it because it just sounded too oddball, right? And so, fast forward that to 2015, 2016, 2017, I wouldn't even say those words in the television, a panel presentation on CNN or MSNBC or even Fox, because I still thought it sounded too kooky. And then I started understanding what was really going on around me. And then I, kind of figured out that, I was approached in late May 2016 by an FBI informant. And the idea that I never would have thought this guy was an FBI informant because the guy was such a crackpot. But I started understanding what was going on around me. And the words started coming out of my mouth with great ease on CNN and the other cable networks. When you say deep state, you still get people rolling their eyes. But I'm here to tell you, Michael, I think that fewer and fewer people are so quick to reject it. Now, the theme that I'm looking at and I think is really important is, we've always said that we're so different from the Soviet Union, Russia, the former Soviet Union. And I think fundamentally we're a much more moral nation, driven by honor and a unique form of patriotism. It's different in Russia. I lived there for a long time in the 90s. In Russia, the people talk about a group called the Siloviki. That's what they call it, Siloviki. That is basically the national security apparatus, the people who are really in charge of the Kremlin. The Siloviki put Putin in place. And the people in Russia talk about the Siloviki, and some people roll their eyes. But nobody who lives there rolls their eyes because they know the deep state exists. And the Siloviki didn't just put Putin in place. Now, Putin rules over the Siloviki. He's bigger than them. But in 2000, they also removed, Boris Yeltsin. And I watched as the Siloviki ran things from behind the screen, right? Like behind the curtain. And we're not just talking about the active duty director of the FSB like Putin was under the last years of the Yeltsin administration, or, the defense secretary, et cetera. In Russia, the Siloviki is also made up of former heads of the security apparatus, right? And I started, when I finally was convinced that it's, maybe there is a deep state in the United States, I started seeing the parallels, because I don't believe that the deep state in the United States is necessarily run by people who are in active service of the government. I think there's a lot of people who are former, like, for example, John Brennan, right? James Clapper. None of these guys are in office right now, but they were running a conspiracy from their government desks, and I believe in cahoots with people who were former members of the national security apparatus. And the irony here is the following. We spent so much of the last 2 years watching people wring their hands over how we were under attack by Russia. I believe that Russia tried to meddle in our elections. I don't think it's unique. I think they do it all the time. I think we do it as well. We do it differently. We don't tend to poison people, but we used to, right? And we've caused regime change.
And not just poison people. They've assassinated foreign leaders,
right,
in the not so distant past.
Right. And by the way, that, if you remember the history of the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, the Eisenhower Commission, that was the Senate, the House, and the administration in 75, right? 74, 75, reforming our national security apparatus in reaction to discovering that we were killing foreign leaders and causing regime change with murder, with assassination. That was also done in reaction to finding out that the FBI was not just, scanning the front of our envelopes; they were opening them and reading them, and then resealing them. After the Church Committee was finished, it didn't end, so honorably, but we saw hundreds of CIA officers rift, and FBI and IRS and even the NSA, which at the time we didn't even know existed. So your parallel was perfectly true. Now, again, back to the irony. The irony of the left, first and foremost, is that David Corn, who I know and I like, David Corn and I have, dined together and had a drink together. I don't agree with anything he says, but Mother Jones was ranting and raving about the deep state, and now somehow they're friendly to it. I find that ironic. Secondarily, actually back to that, David Corn worked with the FBI to bring this about. He gave them information. Mother Jones wouldn't be caught dead working with the FBI just 5 years ago.
He gave a copy of the dossier to James Baker, the general counsel of the FBI.
Right. You wouldn't have caught anyone at Mother Jones doing something like that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts. Right. But the second thing that's really ironic to me is that all this hand-wringing over how Russia attacked our nation, and we're a nation of laws and freedom, and we can't let Putin pull the puppet strings on our president, et cetera, et cetera. Right now we're living in Russia. The American Soloviki tried to bring down a legally elected president of the United States. Then after he was, after they failed to stop him from being elected, they tried to thwart him taking the office, and then tried to knock him out of his seat. And I think all the time acting like a Russian Soloviki. The only thing they didn't do was poison him or assassinate him. And I still have fears of that.
Well, if all you say is true, and I would agree with most of it, it raises some pretty fundamental questions about the nature of the American Republic. And this I think, is why you see a lot of elite conservatives and neoconservatives bristle when the term deep state gets brought up, in addition to liberals and Democrats who are dismissive of it, because they think that it has a connotation of a moral equivalency between the deep state that supposedly exists in the U.S. and the deep state elsewhere, whether it's Russia, Turkey, other countries that aren't viewed as beacons of freedom and liberty as the U.S. has. And I remember when, shortly after Trump took office, he did an interview with Bill O'Reilly during the Super Bowl. And I'm sure you remember this. Trump said something to the effect of, "Well, yeah, Putin's a killer, but we're killers too. What do you think? We're so innocent?" So Trump actually, in saying that remark, kind of undercut this notion of American exceptionalism in a way. And if we do have a deep state in the United States that has such autonomy that it could take all these extreme measures to thwart a presidential candidate and then an elected president, then that's got to prompt some kind of reevaluation of this kind of American exceptionalism mantra that everybody across the political spectrum has been almost indoctrinated with since they were children.
Living in Moscow for 7 years, rarely going home, I left after 7 years feeling that America was exceptional. I arrived thinking that America was exceptional. I saw things going down in Russia that I knew that I would never see in my own nation. So I don't think you compare the two countries on par. But let me tell you something. I was sent in 1994 by the Clinton administration to Russia to meddle in their elections. I'll repeat that. I was sent by the Clinton administration in 1994 to meddle in Russia's elections. And I did. I was there for 1 year working for the embassy, and then another 6 years. I worked on dozens of elections in Russia. I wrote, my team wrote the first draft Russian election law. We were meddling, but openly. The International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the International Foundation for Election Systems, a list of American NGOs that were in Russia after the wall fell is innumerable. And we were there on a multi-billion-dollar program to teach Russia how to have a proper democracy. What's interesting, just as an aside, people wonder how these people at the Internet Research Agency were able to, how they were able to target Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, how they understood targeting, how they understood looking at polls and understanding what the numbers are. It's easy. We taught them how to do it in the 90s. I held classes at many different universities and political organizations across the 89 states of Russia to teach them how to target people through polling data. I mean, they know what's going down. But from my perspective of American exceptionalism, we meddle in their elections and other elections as they meddle in ours. I believe the boundaries that make me still feel that American is exceptional are there. Now we don't, after the reforms of the American Slovaki in the 70s, we no longer murder and assassinate foreign leaders as far as we know, right? We didn't know we were doing it then, by the way. And I think that, there are things that we won't do. We won't use plutonium to kill people in a teapot. There are things we won't do. But,
we still invade countries on occasion and oust presidents.
You got to keep in practice, I suppose, right? But from my perspective, the only difference between American meddling, let's say, and Russian meddling is the degree to which you're willing to go. And from my perspective, the things that we do, Vladimir Putin was onto this pretty early. I first met Vladimir Putin in early 90s at an event in St. Petersburg where he was deputy mayor. And the event, I was host of the event. And we were talking about writing the St. Petersburg Oblast election law. And I met him at that event. I realized he didn't like Americans much. And the times that I ran into him, it was very clear he was of the clique in Moscow that didn't appreciate the amount of time that America was involved with them and their election system. I think the Russians feel exceptional as well, right? The problem we have is where their boundaries lie. They're very different from ours, but we do meddle in very fundamental ways.
Yeah, I remember a speech Barack Obama gave in 2009. It may not have been a speech, maybe just remarks, where he said he was asked to give his own interpretation of American exceptionalism, and he said something to the effect of, well, I'm sure, the British feel that they're exceptional, the French feel that they're exceptional, and even the Russians. I don't know if he actually studied the Russians or which countries he specifically referenced, but his point was that people who live all over the world, in some sense, view themselves as exceptional because, that's just they're in the environment that they're in. And I think there's actually a growing recognition of some version of that on the right now in light of everything that's gone on with the Russia fiasco.
As I said, it's just boundaries. It's character. It's morals. A great example, perhaps as an aside, I was on my way to an event in Moscow on the Ring Road, and Sadovio Katso, it's called, the Garden Ring Road, and my driver drove past. We got into a car, what do you call it, traffic, and we realized that in the middle of this 10-lane section of the Ring Road, there was a man dead in the center. He was laying there. Clearly, had been struck by a car, and people were going around him. And we went to our event, and 4 hours later, we went back, and the man was still there, but he had an orange cone next to him. There are things. The value of human life is different in every nation. In the United States, it didn't matter if this guy was a drunk or a homeless man or whatever. He would have been taken care of immediately, right? Our moral code allows us to do certain things and encourages us to not do others. Would we poison someone? Would we assassinate someone? Would we invade Crimea? Probably those are things that we would not do, right? But what's the difference between America and the orange cone in the middle of the road, right? I got to tell you, what's interesting to me is, and there's a comment I use often on Twitter. People. I served the United States Army. I was in the 25th Infantry Division. I've served my country overseas. I'm very proud of being an American, and friends of mine who know me around the world know that I wear it on my sleeve, right? But at the same time, people on Twitter, Facebook, the nasty types or the bots or whatever, will call me a traitor. How could you ever work with Russia? You traitor, right? But at the end of the Obama administration, there were, I think, 30 people with connections to Obama, Hillary, other key Democrats who were registered to work on behalf of Russia in Washington, right? My answer to all these people on social media oftentimes was, get yourself a passport, see the world, understand that they're not like us.
Yeah. So moving on, you appear on page 61 of Volume 1 of the Mueller Report. And this has to do with what you mentioned earlier, this individual who approached you in May of 2016, offering information of some kind on Hillary Clinton. And that was the impetus for your being embroiled with Mueller starting in 2018. I guess just give a rough encapsulation of the events that led you to being contacted by Mueller and then dealing with Aaron Zelinsky over the course of your, I think, 2 interview sessions. How do you kind of place that all into context right now?
I was actually in the jackpot since July of 2016 when Hillary Clinton put out the first press release in reaction to the information that she was gleaning from Fusion FBI. I should call him Fusion FBI. And in that press release, she said that I was one of 5 people, including Paul Manafort and some others, who were the liaisons to the Kremlin. And that was the first time I got caught in this jackpot. And by that time, I had already left the campaign in a disagreement with Corey Lewandowski. And I could feel it when that press release came out. I said, oh, this is something. They're on the road to do something here. This is going to turn into something. So I first felt peril in July of 2016. I didn't realize that in the late May of 2016 that an FBI informant had called me looking to offer the campaign dirt on Hillary Clinton. This guy Henry Greenberg came to me, I believe, on May 26th through my business partner. I own a PR firm, and my business partner is Russian. I met him. He was my partner in a PR firm in Russia. He emigrated some years ago and represents our firm in Miami. He does events and art shows and event public relations. And this guy Henry Greenberg came up to him at an art opening for an artist, a Russian artist based in Berlin, showing in Miami Beach. And he said, "I understand you work for Michael Caputo." And Zhora said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, listen, I've got a restaurant I'm opening up on the Miami River. Why don't you come talk to me tomorrow about doing our publicity?" Of course, My partner was very happy to see that we might have another restaurant to represent. Back then, and even now, we represent restaurants and restaurant chains. And so he went the next day to this Miami River location that was nowhere. It was a desolate former, a boat repair yard. And he arrived and he said, yeah, this is where the restaurant's going to be. But you work with Michael Caputo. I have something I want to give him for the Trump campaign. Can you get a hold of him for me? And my partner's like, sure. He hit his button and he said, Michael, this guy says he's got something for you guys. He handed him the phone. And I told him, look, I'm leaving the campaign. I'm going to the convention. If you got something for the campaign, you can talk to Roger Stone. He lives down there in the Miami area. So I set them up to sit and meet. They met, I think, the next day, and Roger rejected it. He had offered Roger proof that from a Ukrainian associate that the Clintons were laundering donations through the Clinton Foundation or something like that. But nothing about emails or whatever. And Roger had rejected it because he, like I did, thought he was a crackpot. And I was already in by July of 2017, the House Intelligence Committee, and then May 1st of 2017. July of 2017 with the House Intelligence Committee and May of 2018 with the Senate Intelligence Committee. So the Greenberg contact was not a predicate for me to be called. The predicate for me to be called is that I'm still the only person in history, right, to work for the White House under the Bushes, the Kremlin under Yeltsin, and then, the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, on his campaign. I was in the jackpot because of, my resume more than anything. It's not that they knew I had done anything. I was the only one. I probably had more contact with Russians than every single person in Trump Tower combined. Because, in my household, we speak Russian. My wife is Ukrainian. And when her mother-in-law is with us, we speak Russian, right? So I'm in there because of who I am and my history, the 90s, not because of 2016. But it wasn't until my interview with Mueller that this Greenberg character actually came out of the woodwork in my discussions with investigators. Henry Greenberg, that sounds like somebody from Miami Beach, doesn't it? Doesn't exactly sound like his real name, which is Gennady Vostretsov. And I didn't know anything about him. I thought he was a nut job. So did Roger. But it became very clear in a discussion with the Mueller investigators that it was much, much more.
So when you were initially called to appear before the Mueller investigators, there was no mention of Greenberg. I mean, did they actually cite a reason, or are they required to cite a reason as to why they were making contact with you in the first place?
No, actually, it went down a little differently, and this is what confuses some of the conspiracy theorists on the left who like, these Twitter sleuths. I met Greenberg at the end of May 2016, and I met him on the phone. He called me. I was on the phone with him for 2 minutes, right? That's when the contact took place. And so when I was asked by the House Intelligence Committee in 2017, had any Russian ever offered me information about Hillary Clinton, I said, not that I recall. I didn't remember this 2-minute telephone conversation because there was no follow-up. There was no information given, and I thought he was a crackpot, right? A lot of crackpots in Miami. That's why they have Florida Man, those great stories of the Florida Man. I just thought it was another nut job. And by the way, at Trump Tower on the 5th floor where the campaign headquarters was, there was a room that was dedicated to just the buckets and buckets of mail that would come into the president. And it was all people sending letters of encouragement, people sending letters of threat, But there was a whole, I've been on campaigns all my life, right? And there's always somebody calling you up and saying, I have information which will win your election for you. And you become used to that. You become familiar with the feeling of being led down a primrose path to nothing, right? And typically, most experienced campaign hands will roll their eyes and pass the phone to somebody else because they don't want to get caught up in that sticky wicket. The vast majority of this stuff ends up not true. At the Trump campaign, it was the Clintons You can imagine how many, people were giving us information that would, destroy her campaign. That mailroom with buckets and buckets of mail had hundreds, maybe thousands of letters talking about Arkansas crimes and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera. So when Henry Greenberg had a 2-minute telephone conversation with me offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, it was just another letter in a bucket in that room, right? So I didn't remember it when I was asked at the House Intelligence Committee. And I, fast forward to April, that was July of 2017, I hired one of the best attorneys in the world. That's one of the reasons why my bills were so high. I hired, when it became very clear that I was in the crosshairs of this investigation, I hired Dennis Vacco, who was U.S. attorney here in the Buffalo area, the Western District of New York, and later became the Attorney General of New York State. He's an extremely brilliant white-collar criminal defense attorney. I hired him, and so we went through all the stuff leading up to the April telephone call. When he rang me and he said, Michael, I just got, this was April 2018, the call that you never wanted to get. And I said, Mueller. He said, yeah, I heard from Mueller and I heard from the Senate. You're going to have to go before the Senate and Mueller in the first week of May. I said, fine. No way of getting out of it, right? He said, the Senate thing is not a problem. That's a political hearing, a political interrogation. The Mueller thing is a criminal investigation. The political hearings, the political investigators, they're there to ruin your reputation as a Republican and an associate of Donald Trump, right? The criminal investigators want to put you in jail. So he said, come, we got to prepare. And he has this unique way of getting someone prepared, just drilling you. And as we were sitting there together, and he said, did any Russian ever speak to you? I said, of course not. We went through that with the House. And he said, no, Michael, this is a criminal investigation. Did anyone ever tap you on a shoulder at a store in a mall? When you were in Miami, did anyone ever stop at your table at a sidewalk cafe? Did anyone ever step on your heel? Did anyone ever offer you anything? Any Russian ever? I said, I got this crazy phone call once, but it's nothing. He looked at me and he said, what was this? I told him the story about how Greenberg rang me and how he came to me via my business partner. And he put his pencil down. He said, Michael, you didn't remember that? I said, no, it's a 2-minute conversation. He said, well, you better remember every bit of it because I'm pretty sure they sent him to you. I said, why would that be? He says, listen, this sounds exactly like what we did. So you better come up with an answer so that you can directly answer. So when the Mueller team was questioning me, Aaron Zelinsky in the center and 2 different FBI agents on either side, the FBI agents completely quiet through the whole thing, by the way, only asking one question at the end, taking copious notes and leafing through 3-ring binders. And Aaron Zelinsky with one stack of papers on one side of me, one stack on the other, going through a stack of papers, asking me question after question after question. And he's leading up to, this isn't random. Like you go to a House hearing or a Senate hearing, you're going from congressman to congressman to congressman. The questioning becomes rather random. These guys aren't messing around. They're directly moving you toward a target, right? And it got to the point where he picked up a stack of papers. I thought it was my testimony to the House. And he asked me, Mr. Caputo, did any Russian ever offer you any information on the Hillary Clinton campaign? And I looked at him. I looked at my attorney. And Dennis looked at me. He gave me this knowing glance and, a slight nod of his head. And I went all these hearings with a binder with answers for everyone, for every question possible, because I prepared people for congressional hearings many times in the past. And I do litigation support. I prepare defendants and witnesses for inquiry and investigation. So I had my question and answer handbook. I opened it up to the tab for Greenberg, and I said, yes, indeed, someone did. A guy named Hank Greenberg, and I went through and I told him what he was. And Zelinsky's face fell like a cake. I mean, I don't think this young guy should ever play poker, because it was very clear that he was completely disappointed in the fact that I answered in the affirmative. And I said, Henry Greenberg is I believe, an American citizen of Russian descent. He called me. This is how it went down. Roger rejected it, etc. And he said, Mr. Caputo, how do you know he's an American citizen? I said, I don't know. Maybe he told me. I guess I kind of assumed. And he said, he's not an American citizen. He's a Russian. I looked at my attorney. He looked at me, and it's like, oh, really? How the heck do you know that? Right? So we went back and forth, and they tried to jam me up on this in ways I can describe if you want, but it's off topic. After the interview, 4 or 5 days, and this is like a very intense, proctology appointment. It takes you a little while to recover from it. 4 or 5 days later, I called up Dennis, and I said, Dennis, I've caught my breath. I'm back in Buffalo. I've had a weekend to think about it. And do you think they really sent him to me? And Dennis said, yeah, I do. So what do you mean? He said, this Greenberg guy is an FBI informant, Michael. He said, nah, this is before we heard about Halper and all this stuff. I said, he's a nut job. He's a crackpot. He said, nope, that's an FBI informant. And you're going to have to disclose this story of your contact with him via telephone to the House and to the Senate because you didn't give it to them. I didn't remember. He says, well, you just supplement your voluntarily supplement your testimony and you're in the clear. That's the rules of the House and the Senate. So he said, before you do that, I would figure out who he is. And I said, we decided I should hire a private investigator in Russia and in the United States. And within, I'd say 72 hours, my U.S. private investigator called me up and made sure I was sitting down. And I said, well, what's this about? He said, this guy, Greenberg, that's not his real name. He's got 4 aliases. And I have absolute proof through sworn statements in federal court that he was a FBI informant for 17 years. Now, I was floored, completely floored, because of course, when I was able to prove that he was an FBI informant, that whole contact took on a whole other kind of texture and contour, right? Somehow or another, the FBI thought that Henry Greenberg was going to jam me up and jam up Roger and therefore jam up Trump. But because we walked him, we turned him away, it didn't work out.
So when you were in the room with Zelensky and he has this very conspicuous reaction when you bring up Greenberg, or the man who went by the alias of Greenberg, was your inference that he had intended to catch you on some kind of technical lie or omission if you hadn't brought up Greenberg? If you had denied that you had any contact with Russians, he then could have charged you with a false statement?
I believe so, and so does my attorney, who has far more experience than Zelensky. In this way, first of all, if I had answered in the negative because he already knew about Greenberg, if I had answered in the negative like I had at the House, and he knew I had at the House, and at the Senate the day before, they hadn't asked me any questions about Russians offering me dirt on Hillary Clinton, but I didn't volunteer it at the Senate. I volunteered another contact that I thought had occurred. I still think it occurred, but I didn't volunteer Greenberg. I believe that they were trying to jam me up on not remembering that telephone conversation. But when the telephone conversation, when I recalled unprompted or unchallenged, it became about the date this telephone conversation happened. And he said, when did that happen, Mr. Caputo? Zelensky did. By the way, Zelensky's hair is perfect. He said, when did that happen, Mr. Caputo? I said, I don't know. I think, early June, mid-June, because I wouldn't have rebuffed him to Roger if I were still at the campaign. I feel like I probably rebuffed him because I was no longer at the campaign. I was at the Republican convention as the president's communications director. So I probably would have rebuffed him for that. I think first week of June. He said, are you sure? And I said, I don't know. I really don't know when it was, but I think first week of June. He said, Mr. Caputo.
Wait. Can I just interrupt there? I mean, so if you had done all this extensive preparation, you wouldn't have gone and found the phone record so you knew the exact date?
No. First of all, I didn't know who he was until after my interview with Zelensky. But also, up until even when I was reading my statement on Greenberg, I thought he was some kind of crackpot. Additionally, I went back in my phone records. I never had email conversation. I had a text conversation with Roger about it. It was to the extent of, was there anything there with Greenberg? He said, no, he's a nut job. Well, sorry to waste your time. That's what it was. I went back, in my phone through all my texts with Roger, and my phone text conversation with Roger began. I had a telephone meltdown, and my text conversation with Roger began, and after that happened. So I didn't even really worry about it because I still thought the guy was a crackpot. I didn't find any record. I did look. So I said, I think first week of June, and then Zelensky pulled out my text messages, and he said, Mr. Caputo, does this text exchange sound familiar to you? I said, yeah, it does. Two or three things back and forth from Roger. And he said, well, these text messages happened on May 26th of 2016. And he said, you, Mr. Caputo, and my attorney stopped him. And he said, Mr. Zelensky, I want you to stop right there. Gentlemen, please leave the room. I want to confer with my client. And Zelensky and the two FBI agents got up to walk out. And it was a very tense moment. I didn't know what was going on. I'm just, I'm from East Aurora, New York. We have 1,700 houses in our village. I'm a father and a husband and a PR guy. I wasn't ready for the intensity of that moment. And Dennis said to me, are you sure you're being candid? Yes. He said, you're completely honest to me, Michael. And I said, yes, I really don't know when this happened, but I think it was after I left the campaign, because why would I send it to Roger if I was on the campaign? Roger wasn't on the campaign. He said, so you honestly believed that it was after you left the campaign? I said, yeah. He said, could it have been when you knew you left the camp, you were leaving the campaign to go to the convention, but you hadn't left yet? I said, maybe. He said, when did you find out you were leaving the campaign? I said, middle of the week before Memorial Day. He said, that kind of lines up with this. I said, yeah. And he said, okay. And he brought in Zelensky and the FBI agents. He said, gentlemen, I am completely convinced that my candidate is being completely, that my client is being completely candid. I believe he just didn't remember the date, and he agrees that it probably happened, that it happened when you say it happened. So I suggest you move on. And Zelensky's face was like a stone. And he moved on. And I think at that moment, if I didn't have a good attorney, if I had brought my brother-in-law, right, or something like that, my divorce attorney, I had attorneys offered to pay me to come represent me, right, just to be a part of this. And if I hadn't gone out and hired a gunslinger, I think that Zelensky would have walked right over him. But Zelensky didn't walk over somebody who had twice the experience in federal prosecutions that he did. And we moved on. If you know what happened to George Papadopoulos, it was the exact same thing.
Right. I've interviewed him on this podcast, actually.
Yes, I know. I listened to it. It was the exact same thing. They just plowed over him because they scared him, and he didn't have proper representation. I think when that exchange happened, he didn't have any representation at all. I think it was
that's right. Yeah.
So if I later on, Vaco told me that those FBI agents had handcuffs on their belt, and they would have used them. They would have used them because I misremembered a date.
Right. But
for no reason, right? I'm like, okay, didn't matter if it was the first week of June or last week of May to me because the guy was a crackpot. It was like there was a guy that stood in front of the Trump campaign headquarters in Trump Tower from Haiti. He was there in a suit, and he had an easel with a big, huge display on the easel about how the Clintons had ripped off billions from Haiti in earthquake relief. And every time you walked in, he would hand you a sheaf of papers that proved it. When did that guy give you those papers, right? Was it a crackpot? Maybe, maybe not. But it wasn't something that was really memorable to me. I didn't know when the Haitian guy gave me papers. I didn't know when this whack job called me for 2 minutes on the cell phone. I didn't know. So they would have jammed me up if I didn't have proper representation just to get me to turn on Roger Stone, right? Not to give them evidence on Roger Stone, because I have none, but to lie about Roger Stone. You saw what they did to Jerry Corsi. what they tried to do. I think Jerry Corsi did give evidence that they're going to try and use against Roger Stone, probably concocted evidence, because I don't know what Corsi was doing in that situation. But from my perspective, I almost got Papadopoulos.
What is your theory about Zelensky overall? Because my sense is that he was sort of delegated by Mueller to come up with some colluder, right? I mean, he had to find the phantom colluder and the linchpin of this wider conspiracy. That's why he was dealing with Corsi later on, as you mentioned. He seemed to be chasing every loose end that could have established something related to the core investigative impetus for the special counsel to begin with. And whether it was people that he could trap on a technicality or whatever, it seems as though that was his basic mandate.
It was, I think you have to understand Zelensky deeper. It's there were so many Yale Law School graduates on that team. There were dozens of years of Yale Law School experience there. And all these people with their, $500,000 legal education, college loan paybacks, and et cetera, they went through a 2-year investigation. They found themselves in the clown tent, in the freak show tent, staring at Jerry Corsi and the comedian Randy Credico holding this dog and Roger Stone. That's not why they went to Yale. Their parents had to be so proud. My perspective is, Zelensky, who was, I think, a third generation, at least second generation legacy at Yale, was trying to make his bones on this investigation. He hadn't really done much until then. He'd had some successful prosecutions of criminals in Baltimore. But before that, he was sailing tall ships in Brazil and in the Negev desert in Israel, studying migratory birds, the things that rich kids do, right? For Zelensky, I agree with you. He was assigned the task of finding the colluder, and that to him was a fantasy, one that he wanted to prove. I think when he sat down with me on May 2nd, 2018, he believed there was Russian collusion in his soul. From my perspective, the fact that he failed to prove it will probably, on his deathbed, he'll say that was the greatest disappointment of his life. And I'm kind of a burr under his saddle, I think, because I raised I think $380,000 for my legal fees on GoFundMe and other sources. And there was enough there for me to pay for other people's legal fees, other witnesses, which I was happy to do. And I put the word out. Anybody who was called in, you couldn't be a target or a subject of the investigation. You had to be a witness, and you couldn't come from money, or you couldn't get the money anywhere else, right? I will help you if there are a lot of working class, middle class people that called in there and couldn't afford this stuff, right? So I got applications from people to pay their legal fees here and there. And I was paying, like, Kirsten Davis, Roger's friend, who was the Manhattan Madam, if you remember. She was running, I don't know, Roger's something or other during the convention. Who knows? I don't remember. But Kirsten is somebody I know. She'd spent time in prison for prostitution or something like that. Roger's got an eclectic group of friends. I like her very much. She's a nice person. She's made mistakes in her life, but I saw her as someone that they
didn't. She try to run for governor at one point?
Yeah, she ran the same year that I did with Paladino. That's how I met her. And Roger ran her campaign while I was running Paladino's. I mean, I think that whole gambit was try to get create a party and get it on the ballot, because if you get 50,000 votes, you got a party in perpetuity, and or at least for the next 4 years. In New York, Roger was trying to create a New York State political party. Anyway, whatever his motivation was, Kirsten, the Manhattan Madam, was his candidate, and he thought that kind of comic candidate model would gather 50,000 votes. Anyway, I knew her and I liked her, but I knew that since she was probably still on probation or something like that, still had a federal sword swinging over her head, that she would be targeted for pretty aggressive interrogation. So I hired her a Dennis Vaco of her own, someone who was a U.S. attorney who wouldn't take any crap from this perfect-haired fella from Yale. And sure enough, I never spoke to her attorney. I'm very careful about that. I have attorneys who are an attorney who's on my legal trust board, and he chooses the attorneys for me. And she was represented by a pipe swinger, so they didn't get anywhere with her. I paid for some other people's legal fees. Another one that's very frustrating to them, is still frustrating them, is Andrew Miller. Andrew Miller was Rogers' kind of like Guy Friday for many years, but Andrew's a libertarian. Andrew actually is very close with Governor Gary Johnson. He was his body guy on the campaign trail and was not supporting Donald Trump. He knew Donald Trump because he was Roger Stone's right-hand guy for the better part of 5-6 years, and had spent a lot of time with Trump, and for whatever reason didn't like him, right? So when Roger started getting deeply involved with the Trump campaign, Andrew said, look, I'm going to take off, have a good time, I'm leaving. And Andrew left, and believe it or not, bought a pot farm in California, up in the mountains. So he split, went to grow weed in California, and was still running Roger's email accounts. Like Roger, blasts out thousands and thousands of emails every month, every week.
I have a lot of them in my spam folder.
Of course you do. And Andrew was responsible for answering any replies. Roger had somebody else doing the blasts, but if somebody replied, he would be like, well, Roger, this guy wants a t-shirt. Roger, this guy threatened to kill you, whatever, and he would do that from his weed farm in the mountains in California, right? So anyway, he gave up on weed in California for a lot of reasons. It's very hard to make a living in legal weed in California. And he went back to St. Louis, where he was from, with his wife and child to start a house painting or apartment painting business, a commercial painting business. And he had just moved there, was living with his mother until they found a house. And he came home in his paint-covered overalls one day, and there were 2 FBI agents on his porch. They interviewed him for 2 hours under the threat of a subpoena that he would have to go to Washington. And in the end, they subpoenaed him anyway. So he called me up, and I said, I happen to have these legal fund. I'll pay your legal fees, and you just got to hire a solid attorney. And I got him in touch with Paul Kamenar, who has challenged and hopefully will challenge it all the way to the Supreme Court, Mueller's appointment as against the Constitution. Andrew Miller was represented by competent counsel. Kirsten Davis was represented by competent counsel. I was paying as many people's legal fees as I could who I thought deserved it and needed the help. And everywhere Zelensky looked, he came up against a really good attorney. And that's not the norm for these investigations. They usually run into Papadopoulos types who just want to get it over with quick and don't have proper counsel.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but yesterday I published a column on Maria Butina.
Yes.
And Zelensky was apparently so desperate to find this colluder, even at a very late stage in the investigation, that in January of this year, he showed up at the Alexandria Federal Detention Facility where Butina was being held and interrogated her. And of course, She appears nowhere in the Mueller report. She had nothing to do with anything virtually. But that's how, rock bottom they sunk to find somebody to scapegoat.
Well, Zelensky was interviewing people the week before the report came out. Yeah. I think Zelensky still believes. I can't tell you the person who was interviewed as a leading light in this, and he asked me not to tell anyone, but they required a fourth or fifth appearance by one of my friends who I was helping with legal fees. So do
you think then that Zelensky wanted to just keep this going forever, and maybe Mueller shut it down, or Rosenstein shut it down, or something like that?
I think Zelensky still believes the only reason I believe it is because I look at the kind of person he is, what kind of character he is. He's grown up in a family where he was in the shadow of his father and his grandfather, the third generation legacy, Yale Law. He really wanted to make his bones. This was it for him. He was going to be able to drop in on $1 million a year base with a major firm, white collar defense firm. And this is something that would make his life. And where is he now? He's back in Baltimore where he was. I got to believe that I've seen Zelensky since, and he doesn't. It's very clear he doesn't like me. I don't hold any grudge against him, but he definitely holds a grudge against me. It was
Where'd
Zelensky.
you see him?
I saw him. I was. I'm very close to Roger Stone, as you know. He's my best friend, and I until recently had an office and a company apartment down in Miami, and I'm in the middle of projects, and I had come down to Florida on that Thursday, the 24th of January, whatever it was, and was planning on going to dinner at Roger's house on Thursday night. There was a kind of dinner party there. He usually had one on Thursday nights because, Thursday nights were a ritual for Roger. Every Friday morning was going to be Roger Stone Day, remember? That started in August, right? Well, how many times reporters called me up and said, Michael, tomorrow they're going to arrest Roger at his house. It's Friday. They do the arrests on Friday mornings. What's going on? They would all write stories. Tomorrow's Roger Stone Day. And Roger Stone Day was every Friday, and it never materialized. And when that first started, Roger and his team, including me, we put together how we were going to react. How's Roger going to defend himself? I was going to be the family spokesman. Another person was going to make sure the dogs were fed. It was like we would go through this, and Roger on Thursday nights would prepare as if he would be arrested in the morning. I envisioned him laying on a suit with a perfect cravat and a polished shoe, and shaving before he went to bed. So every Thursday night, he would, from August until it happened in January, Roger was preparing to be arrested the next morning. If you look at, that Friday morning's photos, you notice Roger Stone was wearing a T-shirt that was perfect. The Roger Stone did nothing wrong, and he was clean shaven. And there's a reason, because he was ready, because he'd been ready since August. But Thursday night he was having a dinner. If I had gone to that dinner, I would have stayed the night, right? And I would have been there when they arrested him. But I wasn't. I was in Miami. I got a call from a reporter at 6:06 that morning, 6 minutes after they came into his door. And I jumped up, got dressed, put on a suit, and went to the courthouse like I was supposed to, because I was going to be the family spokesman. I showed up at the courthouse. Roger's attorney said, go down and straighten out the media stakeout because Roger's going to speak after the hearing. And I said, fine. And I left the courtroom, and I walked outside, and there's Zelensky, and two FBI agents. And I walked up to Zelensky. I said, hey, how are you? And I stuck out my hand, and he looked at me, and it was the same reaction like when I told him about Greenberg. This guy can't play poker. He was so upset that I was there. I held up my hand, and he refused to shake it. But the two FBI agents were happy to shake my hand. The one guy who was in my interview was like, hey, Michael, how are you? I hope your family's well. But Zelensky wouldn't even look at me, right? So I go down to the stakeout, and I'm straightening out for Roger. And I get a call from Roger's attorney on my cell phone. He says, listen, this is the last time you're going to hear from us. Roger can't talk to you anymore. I can't talk to you. I'll explain this to your attorney, but do not approach Roger when we come downstairs to the stakeout. I'm freaked out, right? Like I said, I've known Roger since the late 80s or mid 80s. We spoke together all the time, regularly on the phone. So I'm standing there. He comes out. I don't see him. He doesn't see me. I'm in the crowd. There's a photo that's got famous on Twitter of me standing in the crowd looking at him. But I haven't spoken to him since he was arrested. And I'm quite certain it's because I walked up and shook Zelensky's hand. Because Zelensky at that moment, up until that moment, I was working in cahoots with his team like I always had. And it was after that handshake, that offer of a handshake, that my contact with Roger was disallowed, I believe. I don't know why they did it. I suspect it's because they want to isolate Roger as much as possible. Roger involves himself with a wide array of people. And I consider myself one of the reasonable ones, right? Roger talks me off the ceiling all the time. I used to talk to him off the ceiling whenever we're all spun up and angry. It's been a long 2 years, right? But I haven't spoken to him since. And I believe it's because Zelensky got really angry when I approached him. Zelensky has got some kind of a problem with me. I think it's maybe because I figured him out.
I know you've been friends with Roger for a very long time, but To what extent do you assign blame to him personally for the legal situation he's in now? Not that he was colluding with Russia, but because part of his personality is that he gets into these bizarre relationships with like a Randy Credico where he's supposedly threatening a dog, things to that effect. And, throughout 2016, he was obviously exaggerating dramatically the extent to which he had inside information about what WikiLeaks was up to. I mean, what did he do wrong there in your view, or at least, to what extent is he culpable for the predicament that he's in?
The Mueller investigators and the Senate and House investigators have turned campaign politics into a crime scene, right? I mean, what Roger Stone was doing was politicking. There are some people who are straight shooters and work on the front of the envelope all the time. Roger's all over the envelope. He always has been. Roger, by the way, was the original Trumper. He's the original OT. There's no question that he is the reason why the president ran, right? I mean, I was there when I believe they had their first conversation in 1988. He's the one that helped position the president for the presidency. And the idea that he could not be a part of it because he was forced out, I think that really bothered him. It would have bothered me, right? So Roger spent a lot of time trying to be helpful from the outside and remain relevant to the election of the president of the United States. Because there
was this discrepancy about whether he was fired in 2015 or whether he left voluntarily.
Right, but that's the Trump Stone story. They've waxed and waned in their relationship for 30 years. I can think of another time when Roger stopped working with him and Trump was telling people he fired him and Roger was telling them that he quit. I mean, that's just the way people work, right? I mean, did I get fired or did I quit? Right? I went out there and quit on June 20th, 2016 because I thought any minute the president was going to fire me, right? So, because I had sent a tweet about Corey Lewandowski that was inappropriate. And so who fired who? I don't know. But I can tell you that Roger felt responsible for putting the president in position and really wanted to be some force on that campaign. He was trying all these different super PACs, but as you know, the president eschewed super PACs. He didn't like the whole concept. He couldn't get the president to give his super PAC an official imprimatur. The things that Roger was designing his super PAC activity around were like this illegitimate child of Bill Clinton, the African-American kid in Arkansas, others. These are things that didn't interest the Trump campaign. So he was constantly trying to have an impact and positively with the president and just couldn't. He was being kept out by the sharp elbows who were around the president. That's just the way things go down. That is campaign activity. That's how people campaign. Roger may have been exaggerating what he was doing in order to remain relevant, but how do you criminalize that if nothing went down, right? So do I put Roger do I blame Roger for being there? I blame Roger for acting like he did for 40 years. And only when Hillary Clinton got beat did they try to criminalize it. Did they try to turn it into a crime scene? Roger Stone was Roger Stone for 40 years.
True, but I mean, was it a good idea for him to threaten Randy Credico's dog?
You don't read that right. What he said is, I'm going to take that dog from you. He did not say, I'm going to kill that dog. And this will come out in trial. Roger has been upset with the way that Randy Credico treats that dog for a long time. If you go to Roger Stone's house when he had a house, he had 4 or 5 feral dogs in his house, some of them with 3 legs. Roger is, people may think he's a warrior. He is, but he's got a soft spot for a lot of things, and that includes dogs. What he said to Randy Credico is, I'm going to take that dog from you. That meant Roger was going to take the dog and feed it and care for it. And that'll be very obvious in trial.
Yeah, no, I know he didn't threaten to literally kill the dog, but just even getting into a combative exchange at all about a dog, it's just, again, I don't want to I agree that a lot of otherwise ordinary conduct seems to have been criminalized, but at the same time, I think, at least in the court of public opinion, the notion of Roger Stone being entirely blameless, even on an ethical, if not legal level, might not pass muster for a lot of people.
I get that. And there are a lot of people who hate Roger, mostly because he defeated them and because he's gotten into arguments where he went across the line. I mean, some of the things he said about the Bush family offend a lot of standard Republicans. Offends me. I'm very fond of the Bushes. They were my bosses, you know. But Roger is distasteful. He's a libertine. And the question is whether that's a crime scene. You know, Roger did not collude. He did not visit Assange. He didn't threaten Randy Credico's dog. But here you have to understand, going back to that exchange between him and Credico, I know Roger has been around Credico for, 15 years. I've witnessed his relationship with Credico up close for a long time. Credico is a nut job. And if Roger Stone is going to be found guilty for threatening to take Randy Credico's dog, then Roger certainly has chapter and verse of emails and exchanges between him and Randy Credico where Randy Credico threatened to kill him. Randy Credico threatened to put a bullet in the head of a film producer that was with Roger. You know, these guys, they talk that way. That's their relationship. Is it healthy? Hell no. Nothing around Randy Credico is healthy. The guy is legendary for his, you don't want to say too much, but he's not someone I consider credible. Now, good luck putting Randy Credico on the stand with Roger Stone. His dog could be a better witness.
Roger Stone is under a gag order now, as far as I know. I mean, do you think he somehow intends to circumvent that, or is there any indication that he's not going to abide by the terms of the gag order, if only so he can, speak in public in a way that could influence opinion as he approaches trial?
I don't think Roger wants to go to jail, right? Judge Berman put Paul Manafort in the jail for disobeying an order, right? And she most clearly would do that to Roger. I know a lot of people
not just jail, solitary confinement.
Right. A lot of people dislike this judge, but I think she's given Roger enough room to learn his boundaries, right? That horrible mistake that somebody in his retinue committed with that Instagram picture of Judge Berman with that sign behind her, whatever, the Druid sign that looks like was it a Nazi symbol or something? No, it was looked like a crosshairs. That's Roger's standard operating procedure with the people around him not being careful enough. That wasn't Roger trying to threaten Judge Berman, but now that day, I think he almost went to jail, right? I think Roger has learned a very important lesson. I think he's listening to his attorneys. I don't think he's going to try to circumvent the gag order or anything else that the judge does. I can tell you that for a reason. I know that because Roger and I weren't supposed to speak since his arrest. And we haven't. There hasn't even been an attempt, and there would have been many ways to do it. And there's just zero, nada. And my job. What's interesting, though, also, by the way, my job was supposed to be family spokesman, and this gag order basically says that anyone who talks to Roger or anybody on his legal team cannot speak about the case in public or on the media, right? Well, by Zelensky barring me from talking to Roger, Zelensky created the family spokesman, right? Because I am not barred from speaking on Roger's behalf because Zelensky got upset. Now Roger's spokesman, I'm fully capable and within my rights to speak on his behalf. So how is that going to work when his trial comes and I'm not able to speak to his attorneys and I still want to speak on his behalf? I guess that means it's going to be the biggest challenge as a spokesman that I've faced in my entire career, to be able to speak on someone's behalf without knowing chapter or verse what they're going through. I'm going to have to pay attention, right? But Zelensky messed up again. Roger's spokesman is free to speak.
When Roger started getting more involved with Alex Jones and InfoWars, did that raise any red flags for you? I mean, Alex Jones is a guy who first gained a public profile because he was a 9/11 truther. He became more stalwartly pro-Trump in 2015, 2016. But, I mean, as a guy who had, worked for the Bushes and was a little more in the mainstream of Republican politics, that must have aroused some suspicion on your part, no?
Well, I can tell you I reacted to news of Roger working with Alex the same way I reacted to Roger spouting off the conspiracy theory about the JFK assassination in the backseat of his car in 1986, right? I saw that as nutty talk from someone who I adored, right? With Roger ended up in league with Alex Jones, that seemed kind of, I don't know. I mean, as abnormal as that is, it matched up with what I've been hearing from the backseat of his car for 25, 30 years, right? Roger believes what I consider to be some rather outlandish things. I didn't know much about Alex Jones. I met him a couple times. I was kind of out of that circle of Roger's, compadres, his posse, so to speak. But the times I met Alex, I found him to be a kind person and funny, and if nothing else, maybe a little embarrassing. Sometimes he'd say things in public as we're walking down the street that made me a little bit right. Then I started catching Alex on his shows and stuff. I understood why people were disbelieving of him. I was on because of Roger being on the network. I was on that network a couple times. I don't agree with Alex Jones, and I don't. That's not my style of communications consumption. But the idea that he has no platform at all because people disagree with him really gets in my craw. It did raise red flags for me. I'll tell you that. But it's my friend Roger being consistent with his beliefs, working with people that he found comfort with. People, beliefs that I didn't agree with, and people I wasn't all that comfortable around. But, it's like hanging out with your buddy at a football game when he brings his pal who drinks too much, right? You still have fun, and you still maybe win the game.
Right. Well, as far as Alex Jones being expelled from all the social media platforms, I agree that that's a disturbing show of power on the part of these unaccountable tech figures in capitulation to political pressure. So, but that's separate from the substance of what Alex Jones promotes. And anyway, I know we're going long here, but that's
before we go any further, I appear regularly on MSNBC. So yeah, I appear on networks that I don't agree with. I mean, do I compare MSNBC?
I think you and I were actually on the same episode of Tucker once.
Yeah, I mean Tucker I love. I mean, I Tucker's my favorite show on television. But anyway, yeah, I'll tell you. I grew kind of fond of Alex Jones, not because of what he believes or how he espouses it, but I kind of like people who rub others the wrong way and don't care. Imagine that coming from somebody who really loves Donald Trump.
Right. So just to circle back to one thing about Greenberg before, lest we gloss over it, but you have this website now where I think it's called the Democratic Dossier, something to that effect. What's the website saying? Yeah,
DemocratDossier.com. It's not mine. It's a friend of mine who has it. Who had high hopes for monetizing it, but it hasn't been. And the only thing up there is my dossier on Henry Greenberg.
All right. Well, regardless of the monetization value, there are some primary documents that you've furnished that elucidate Greenberg's history. And I know that your attorney believes that he was an informant and he was sent specifically to, I don't know, entrap you in some way. But just to play devil's advocate, the guy does seem to be a little bit of a nut job. He's sending these, he's claiming that he has a handler in the FBI. He's going all around the world to these far-flung places, Iran, North Korea. He says that apparently he ceased to be an FBI informant in 2015, and you interacted with him in 2016. So, I mean, is there any legitimate argument that he was not, in fact, an FBI informant? I mean, I think it's plausible that he was, right? But I'm saying, if a critic was listening to this, would they have any grounds to believe that he is not who you say he is?
Sure, I think they could. That you're talking about this sworn document, sworn deposition affidavit that he presented to federal court in California, asking for a green card because the FBI, the way they employ him and other international informants is they offer them visas, working visas, different kinds of visas if they come over and do their bidding. And if you do what they tell you to do and you're successful at it, they'll give you a longer stay. And they may even give you a working visa so that you can work and support yourself. And so, it's like these informants are like chimpanzees. They swing from one visa to the next, right? And when their one visa is almost all the way out, they say, oh, but there's this one guy I can tell you about, and they dangle another vine in front of them of a visa, and they grab on that one and swing that as far out. It's like Tarzan, right? And Vostotsov or Greenberg is just another FBI informant, Tarzan, right? He's swinging from one visa to the next. By the way, at DemocratDossier.com, I have copies, I think 14 of those visas, where his FBI handler's name and telephone number is listed, right? So it's not like he was swearing in an affidavit in federal court asking where his new visa was, and he was lying. He was telling the truth. He was working for the FBI for 17 years up until the day he signed that affidavit, and I got at DemocratDossier.com, I have many of his visas there. The problem I have with that is this. He's still here, right? He's still here. He is a gun criminal. He spent at least 3 years in prison in the United States and 10 years in prison in Russia, a violent criminal. And he is in the United States, and the FBI knows exactly where he is. And yet in 2015, he was looking for another vine to swing on. Somehow or another, he's still here. So if to believe that he was not working for the FBI at the time, you have to believe that a dangerous, violent, criminal, ex-con Russian is being allowed to live here just why not, right? No visa, he's here illegally. I don't believe that, number one, because the guy is dangerous. I know the crimes he's still committing in South Florida. He's dangerous. Right now, he's living in a motel in Hallandale Beach, a little Skivats hotel down there, motel. It's something straight out of Barfly, that great movie. And this guy, he's still dining al fresco in Miami Beach. And if he's here without a visa, I'm Sandra D, right? He's definitely got a visa. Now, let's say he's working for the FBI, right? And people tried to tell me on CNN and elsewhere, well, he's working for the FBI for 17 years, and do you have proof he was working for the FBI that day? And I said, actually, there's a possibility he worked for the FBI 17 years. He's worked for the FBI now, and he took off his lunch hour to come talk to me and Roger Stone. Yeah, that's possible. Does it sound plausible to you? In the middle of, a national security Siloviki investigation into the Republican candidate for president? Isn't that a little bit too much of a coincidence for you?
Do you have reason to believe that Bill Barr or this new U.S. attorney in Connecticut who's been appointed to look at the origins of the investigation, Durham, are going to be evaluating any of this? Have you attempted to contact them, or what's the status of that as far as you can tell?
I believe that in the first week of May of 2016 that I was contacted by an American national security contractor who offered me copies of Hillary's missing emails and said that they were at the office of James Clapper in the White House.
The private server
right?
emails.
Right. And he was trying to offer them to me. I was in Trump Tower at the time. I turned him down and said, "That's dangerous. I'm not taking a hold of that. You should go and become a whistleblower. Get him yourself." But I can that one and this one and a third one. Greenberg, this guy Claggett, the national security guy, and another one. I think I was approached at least once, maybe 3 times. I reported that to Horowitz, the DOJ IG, in July through my attorney. My attorney, by the way, has relations with all these people, right? It's not like he's somebody's divorce attorney from Arkansas, right? He's a prosecutor type, right? Who knows all these people. And he writes to Horowitz at the IG's office and the Department of Justice and says, we've proven that Greenberg was an FBI informant. We can't prove that he was working during his lunch hour or that he was taking the lunch hour off. But here's chapter and verse on Greenberg. And by the way, this other guy approached Caputo in the first week of May, and we think we might have a third one. We'd like to talk to you about it. We never heard a word. That was July 2018. So we went ahead, and my attorney, Dennis Vacco, offered that to them again in January of 2019, and this time also gave it to Huber in Salt Lake City. And that's, 6 months ago. We haven't heard a word. So I'm not really optimistic about what's coming out of Horowitz or Huber, right? But this week, we turned over all of our information to the U.S. Attorney Durham in Connecticut, and we hope to hear from him. I can tell you, after telling all the investigators, House, Senate, Mueller, trying to tell the IG, Huber, and now Durham, nobody was interested. Nobody was the least bit interested. And that, to me, is astonishing.
Yeah, but what's the explanation for that? Because Barr, at least personally, seems quite interested in delving into all this.
I don't even know if a U.S. Attorney Durham has even opened the envelope yet. We just did it this week. I have high hopes that we'll hear from Barr and or Durham, and I volunteered to come to speak to them at any given time. I have much higher hopes with Durham and Barr than I had with Huber and Horowitz. I was deeply disappointed by Horowitz and Huber. I'm awfully hopeful for Durham and Barr.
Okay, let's wrap up just with a kind of a aimless political punditry question, which I try to avoid for the most part, but what the heck?
This is CNN.
You sound exactly like, what's the guy's name who does that?
James
Earl Jones, right?
James Earl Jones with a head cold.
I thought I was speaking to the Star Wars guy because he was Darth Vader, right? Anyway,
right.
So Democrats look like they're moving toward impeachment now. Pelosi is somewhat resistant to it still, but you have members of her leadership team in the House who went so far as to leak the contents of a close-knit leadership meeting this week to the Washington Post because they were that flustered with her reticence. You have multiple Democratic presidential candidates now endorsing at least the initiation of impeachment proceedings. And one thing I hear from a lot of Trump supporters is that they actually somehow welcome this because they think that Trump is going to benefit politically from Democrats overreaching, and it's going to ensure his reelection. They'll sometimes point to the Clinton impeachment as a precedent because Clinton got marginally more popular after that. And I just don't know if that's quite right, honestly. I mean, I think that the grounds on which Trump would be impeached are fallacious, but we don't know how it's going to play out politically. Maybe people just get fatigued with all the Mueller and Russia-related drama, and they assign partial blame to Trump for it. People talk about Trump's base being energized if the Democrats go down this route. Well, that's probably true, but there's also a Democratic base who could be just as energized because they loathe Trump so much. And, in the midterm elections in 2018, had the highest turnout since 1914, in part because this Democratic base was highly energized. So, I don't know. I'm sure you've heard that line from Trump supporters with regard to impeachment. How do you react to it?
Logically, I've been saying the president will be impeached by House Democrats since August of 2018. To me, that's what the midterms were all about. I think it is a metaphysical certitude that they will impeach the president. It's not that I want it. It's just that it is inevitable. It's going to happen. And that I give you that from 30 years of electoral experience. I've been to, literally hundreds of Grateful Dead shows, right? Most of my friends are liberals. I know what this is crack cocaine, all right? They can't resist it. They're addicted to this. They have radicalized their base. So, and the base is going to demand it. They are demanding it. And let's just understand one thing. This is a curated, planned, paint-by-numbers strategy. I'm telling you, Nancy Pelosi wants to impeach him today. Nadler wants to impeach him today. Schiff wants to impeach him today. Every single one of these people want to impeach him today. But they need to be walked to the edge of that strategy logically and build the case, because they need the people in the middle, not their base. The other Democrats who are already sick of this need to have the case made for them. This is curated. It's curated. This is going to happen. Hillary Clinton, I'm sorry, boy, that's a name we haven't even said today. Hillary Clinton requires this. This has always been about impeachment. If the secret investigations couldn't stop Donald Trump from becoming president, and they couldn't stop him with a special counsel, then it was always going to be about impeachment, and the special counsel must give them the breadcrumbs path they need to get there. And that's what they think they have on obstruction, not on collusion. So this is going to happen. There's no way to avoid it. It is a metaphysical certitude. Now, having said that, I know the people around the president's campaign. Some of them I know really well. Some of them I don't know all that well. So don't forget, Kellyanne Conway, an expert pollster. They are polling this. They're trying to figure out, now, let's say the president endures an investigation for 2 years. It's completely bollocksed his presidency. It's made him angry. They've gone after his children. And the report comes out, and they say no collusion, no obstruction, and the Democrats drop it. It will have zero impact on the campaign, right? It'll be negligible, right? But if the Democrats, with their radicalized base, go after the president again, unreasonably so, and can be proven to be unreasonable, I can see where polling, especially in target states, would reflect that the president gains from this. So to me, it's plausible, even though it's really out there. It's plausible, but this is a briar patch strategy where the president says, bring it on. Bring it on. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not cooperating with you. No, you can't have anything you're asking for. Well, I'm done cooperating. I'm done with this. And he just keeps pushing to the middle of America the message that, look at these freaks. They can't stop, right? So in comes the impeachment. Don't forget. Do you know who? If in order to impeach a president, they must be guilty. You must be charging them with high crimes and misdemeanors. You know what the definition is of high crimes and misdemeanors?
Is it in the Constitution?
No, I'll cut to the chase. There's no definition.
Right.
The definition of high crimes and misdemeanors,
whatever you think it is
whatever the majority of the House of Representatives who are for impeachment believes it is. So if they define jaywalking as a high crime or misdemeanor, he's going to be impeached. So I can tell you he will be impeached because they get to define what high crimes and misdemeanors mean, because their base is absolutely demanding this, because they radicalize these people, because it's crack cocaine. They can't stop themselves. And the Senate won't remove him, and they will be punished at the polls in 2020.
I don't know. Again, that seems plausible to me, but I think it's a little overconfident for Trump supporters, even Trump himself or his campaign people, to just assume that that's automatically a given. I mean, we don't know there could be something that comes out, not on collusion necessarily, over the course of impeachment proceedings that reflects badly on him, or some unexpected event that arises out of impeachment proceedings being underway that could at least redound to his disadvantage in some sense. And on top of that, I mean, does he really want to be one of only 3 presidents in American history that have been impeached? That's kind of not the most favorable group to join.
2 things. Number one, they would not be moving as they are unless they had research that showed that it's a plausible scenario. A plausible scenario that they will impeach, and a plausible scenario that if they play their cards right, the impeachment will destroy the opposition. Right? So I'm quite certain with all the pollsters around the president and the data-rich environment at the campaign that they have a degree of confidence that they can turn the messages against the Democrats. So in this regard, the people who are hapless are blue, not red. Okay? And secondly, I know the president well enough to know that he fears nothing. And he knew when he took this job that if he was going to save America like if he was going to make America great again, he was going to come out scarred, drained of blood, maybe even dead, And the idea of impeachment probably worries him, just like the idea of assassination worries him and everyone around him. If they'll do what they've done, they will do anything. They will do anything. But I believe that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, fears nothing. And whether he becomes one of the 3 guys who was impeached, I don't think that matters to him at all. Because, by the way, there are a lot of firsts that he committed as president that aren't going to go down as a good thing. He doesn't care what people think. And that's the bottom line right there. He and candidates like him, Carl Paladino, in New York, the reason why they are so impervious to pain is he does not care what they think of him. And that, in the end, is what bothers them the most.
Well, he may not care what people think, but he cares about whether he can get reelected. And you need more than just your energized base in order to get reelected. Again, I'm not saying that we know one way or another how it'll play out, but it just seems like there are maybe some serious downsides to this that people within the Trump orbit aren't really giving adequate consideration. But I guess we'll see.
I think they are polling all of this. They're researching this very carefully, and I also believe that there are people on the campaign and in the White House who agree with me that it's a metaphysical certitude, and they absolutely have to be ready for it. I don't think that they can stop it. I don't think that there is anybody, and there's not one person in the Democratic House that is against this. They're pretending to be. It's curated. It's absolutely strategic. Every word is strategic. I mean, I'm sure that at night.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard's against it. I know that, but she might be the only one.
Right. She's my spirit animal. But at the same time, she doesn't reflect a natural opinion in the Democratic leadership. So
that's true.
From my perspective, the Trump campaign, White House will not be able to stop this, and they must be prepared. And the president has probably already. We spoke about impeachment when I was with him in the Oval Office last 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and I said, "What do you think about impeachment?" He shrugged it off like he had ordered the wrong food and had to return it. It didn't bother him at all.
Oh, that's a funny visual.
It's hard to order the wrong food from McDonald's.
Yeah. You have to send Chris to go get him the correct Big Mac.
That's right. But let me tell you something. There is nothing the president won't do to achieve his goals within the rule of law. And he didn't realize he was going to be battling people that didn't care about the law. So the idea that he would be impeached, I don't think the president values their opinion. I think he cares not a whit about what they think. And it drives them to distraction. Listen, I got to tell you, what I want to do? I know people say this a lot, but I want to get a big, huge barrel of popcorn, get in my car, drive to Washington, open up a lawn chair in front of the United States Capitol, and just sit there and watch. That's what I want to do. As somebody who lives in flyover country, and now I was in the jackpot of this, and now I'm on the outside looking in. I want to watch as Donald Trump takes these people apart limb from limb, because that's what's coming.
All right, well, we shall see, and we've gone quite long, so thanks again for doing this and for luxuriating in the abilities of podcasts to go for an extended period of time.
Well, listen, I'll tell you, I have my own podcast. I learned from yours, but mine is stillstandingpodcast.com. I meander on about when the stories like this one, but I learned from listening to yours and some others. I really am thrilled to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I've been following your work for a while now, and I really value your contribution.
All right, thanks a lot. We'll do it again sometime.
Remember, stillstandingpodcast.com.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to it in the various description boxes where this is produced. So,
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
All right, there you have it. Please remember to subscribe on Patreon. You can contribute financially via PayPal if you so please. I'm also going to set up a P.O. box at some point if people want to send physical checks. Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and also subscribe on YouTube where I post these podcasts in full as well as other stuff. All right, see you later.